All right, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whenever you're listening to this. If you're listening to this right now live, good evening. Very, very excited for today's conversation. I've heard a great many things about this gentleman, and including last week's guest, that spoke very highly of him. And then I could already tell from our off-air conversation that this is going to be just absolutely fantastic. And this is a subject that I'm always excited to learn more about. Is just different countries, and then we have some other things that we're going to talk about as well. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Austin in the chat already said that this is going to be very, very good. He's the man and probably going to be the key to peace with North Korea. And I think we all share that optimism, and hopefully that's kind of the plan going forward. But before we jump into today's show, as usual, thank you to the channel members, Abrogate these, and I'm forgetting one. But anyways, thank you guys so much. Feel free to become a channel member for $2.99 a month. I try to make it as affordable as possible. Eddie, good to see you as well. Feel free to head to all the links below where you can find my guest, everything he's got going on, as well as myself this weekend. If you're in the Akron, Ohio area, you can come see a Common Crown live. There are going to be some friends from Twitter out there, Hexcelerate, Alice and Adam Forkey from Put a Fork in It. Really looking forward to that. And it's our first show out in quite a while. We're going to be playing a ton of new original material. So once again, Akron, Ohio at the Vortex. It's going to be us, Stage of Dreams, and there's one other band, Storms of Tomorrow. That's it. Yes, that's December 14th. We go up at 8, and then they'll be playing until about midnight. So feel free to come check us out there. TigerFitness.com through the link below. Fox & Sons Coffee to get some fantastic coffee. I just finished the espresso roast. Very, very good stuff if you like dark coffee. And obviously they have all the other blends. In fact, Steven just sent me a whole bunch of new blends that I'm really excited to try. I just ground up another one of them. I can't remember which one it was. But and then finally, Deemed Fit through the link below to get some really, really good workout clothing. And also to support my wife and I. The code should already be populated, Sarah M25 for 25% off. Anyways, with all my shilling out of the way, let's get right into today's conversation with my guest. All right, everybody, and welcoming to the show, my new friend, Joe Terwilliger. Hopefully I said that correctly. How you doing?
Very good. How about yourself?
Fantastic. Well, I'm very, very happy to have you today. So why don't you give my audience a introduction to you and who you are and what you do?
Well, I'm a professor at Columbia University in human genetics. And mostly I got into that. I actually did my undergrad in music, and then I wanted to come to New York and figured it would be better to go to school because they pay you to go to school in science rather than having to flip burgers to put myself through, my tuba playing career, which, as you can guess, is not a big money maker. So I decided to go. Sorry.
I said, ask me how I know.
Oh yeah, exactly. So I had an offer to come here to study statistical genetics, and so I did. And I was mostly working on developing statistical algorithms and stuff for analysis of data. And people would come to me with data and say, here, analyze this and help me find out what's causing this disease. And it turned out that most of the time, the answer I would give them is, well, you can't answer that question because you don't have the right data. You can't answer that with this sort of data. So I got more involved in designing studies. And when you live in the United States, especially I'm in New York City, the heart of the beast. And in New York City, we're so diverse that it's really hard to do genetic studies because we come from everywhere. So there's all sorts of variation between people that has nothing to do with any given disease. So I spend my effort looking for populations that are more isolated and more interesting because you simplify the problem when there's less variation. Yeah. So I worked for many years in Finland, where in Finland, they're kind of like a big family. They're up in the far north and their language is not similar to any of their neighbors. So it was a really interesting laboratory for studying rare, simple diseases because they had some unusual ones. But then when we started looking at more common diseases, Finland was still too big and not isolated enough. So I started looking for more unusual places. So I've worked throughout the Arctic and other parts of the world. I have a big study in Venezuela, of all places, that we've been doing for 30, 35 years, where we just focused on one individual village that's a kind of an indigenous population and watching what happens to them over time with all the limited environmental exposures and limited amount of genes. So you can learn a lot about it. So I end up working in all these parts of the world that aren't exactly on most people's travel map, because if it was on everybody's travel map, they wouldn't be genetically isolated, because travelers and sailors always leave DNA behind, so to speak. You know, so I ended up working in a lot of these unusual places around the world. I worked in Kazakhstan. I've worked in Venezuela. We tried to do studies in Iran right before Biden took office. And before Biden took office, the Iranians told me we can't do this project anymore because relations are going to get worse under Biden. And I was confused by that, but sure enough, they were right.
Yeah.
And then I've been working as well in Xinjiang in China, where they had problems in the far west of China. And I had a project on the Korean diaspora, which is basically we were looking at Koreans who were deported to Kazakhstan by Stalin in the 1930s. And we were comparing them with Koreans who lived in China right across the border from North Korea. So they were mostly in contact with North Korea and not South Korea at that time in the late 90s. And we worked with Koreans who were adopted in Sweden and raised by Swedish families. So these are the same plants grown in different soil. And the question is, what comes from the soil and what comes from the genes? So kind of asking about nature and nurture. In the process, I met a lot of North Koreans in China and in Kazakhstan, and they were nothing like the stereotype of what I read about and what I thought I understood. So as a scientist, I just become curious and I wanted to go and learn more. And that's how I ended up going to North Korea, which I presume is one of the things you'd like to talk about here. But it's a podcast about health and as well. And I'm a medical school researcher working on epidemiology and all these questions. So I'm open to talk about anything you want to talk about. I mean, I even do powerlifting, as you can see, just like, like you do. So I think and you're a musician as well. So we have a lot in common here. So
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited to learn about all this because I did listen to your show with Kyle and he dropped by in the chat. Joe's by far the most impressive and accomplished libertarian you haven't heard of. And you know what? As long as we've been talking, I'm kind of inclined to agree. So one thing I actually really wanted to touch on, because this has been such like a passion of mine over the last year, is different cultures and like how you mentioned genetics. This has been just absolutely fascinating to me to learn. And I mean, I'm sure as a power lifter that like different races across the world. And once again, I'm not trying to say that like races are inferior, superior to one another. It's just like there are genetic differences all around the world. And then you also learn about, how like Asian cultures, they have. Are you familiar with the concept of like the personal fat threshold?
Sorry, no.
Okay, so basically, the idea is that like every body basically has its own what's called a personal fat threshold. So like you can only get so obese to the point where eventually your fat cells get topped off, and then you start spilling over into your viscera, and that's when you get like the fat around your liver, and then fat on your organs, which is like very, very bad.
Like you mean the difference between like the subcutaneous fat and the
Correct.
yeah.
Yeah. So
mine's fortunately mostly subcutaneous, although not so fortunately for what it looks like.
right. Right. So like Asians have a very, very low fat threshold on average, like as in like most Europeans. So someone like me who's like of Polish, Italian descent, I could get pretty fat. And like I could get huge. Whereas Asians don't have that same genetic capability. African people could get pretty big as well. Whereas, like I said, Asian people typically don't get as obese just because of the way they're genetically designed, which is just like learning that alone is very fascinating to me. And then also,
but they are getting bigger than they used to. So
correct.
There's a huge Western culture influence from diet,
yes,
and as well as exercise, sedentary lifestyle. And you see some very fat people in Korea, and in China as well, and it's increasing over time. So part of it's socioeconomic, and it's like we're starting a study on the Mexican border, actually in Brownsville, Texas, looking at Mexicans north of the border and south of the border. And just in that little difference, the difference in obesity is enormous, because in Texas, you drive your car to get the mail out of your mailbox. And in Mexico, you walk everywhere. And so the diabetes and all this stuff, it's just through the roof. Brownsville is the least healthy city in America. And yet in Matamoros, it's better. And most people think, westernization, great. And it is true that we live longer than they do, right? the question is then, is it quantity or quality of life, or what is it that we actually want to be measured? Talk about this, but obesity for sure is a hugely affected by the changes in our lifestyle in the last 100 years.
Yeah, and this is a conversation I try to have with people, because everybody freaks out about seed oils right now. But what they never look at, you really have to zoom out and look like, okay, much to your point, back in the 70s, we went off the gold standard, right? And then all of a sudden, we were able to extend credit to all these people, and we were also able to make hyperpalatable foods. And seed oils are a part of this, but they're not the main driver. I mean, you have to look at when was the last time you went to a public event that didn't have food or alcohol? Never. Every single
Mhm.
event you go to has food or alcohol, right? And then now, our lives are so great right now that you and I can do this. You're up in New York, I'm here in
Yep.
southwestern Pennsylvania. We're probably about, anywhere from 4 to 7 hours away from each other talking, instantly, like we're face to face.
Yep.
We don't have to walk around. We don't have to work as laborious jobs as we
Yep.
used to have to, 80 years ago. So what, like you said, more sedentary, people eat more food, there's more hyperpalatable food available. When it
Mhm.
comes to social events, we have certain stigmas and cultures around eating. All this kind of eventually contributes to people eventually gaining weight. And like you said, just south of the border outside of Texas, they don't have that same culture there. But in Texas, they have this culture. So
Yep.
what's the difference? The people down in Mexico, they're a little bit leaner. And the
Yep.
people in Brownsville, they're a little bit more obese.
Yep. And you also, just in something as simple as height, there's been
Mhm.
an enormous effect, a positive effect. If you like tall people, I'm tall, so I have to think it's a good thing. But if you go to a pub in England, right,
Mhm.
the door is about here,
Oh, wow.
right, and the jeans haven't changed,
Mhm.
right? We were all a lot shorter 150 years ago, but the
Right.
diet and control of infection and all these other things, especially a lot of protein in diet when you're
Yeah.
young, it's had a huge impact on our size, not just our obesity, but also our height and basically everything else. So, I mean, all these things are really interesting. Like in Venezuela, we have a really interesting study. We have one section where we're following a relatively wealthy population that lives in the city center, and they're
Mhm.
middle class. They have all the Western healthcare and everything else. And then we have a community that's really poor that lives basically on platforms over the top of the water in the lake
Mhm.
because there used to be snakes on land that would eat them if they lived on land.
Yeah.
And that's why it's actually called Venezuela, because when Vespucci discovered it, it looked like a little Venice because they're all living over the water
Mm.
and community that way. So anyway, this population is really poor. They're all infected with intestinal parasites because they crap in the water and then swim in the water and eat the fish out of the water and all this. It's constant reinfection. And the interesting thing is, and there's a lot of other social problems and violence and things like that,
Yeah.
where there's a lot of early death. But if you make it to 40 or 50, they make it to be like 100, and their
Uh-huh.
brains look perfect with none of these sort of the plaques and tangles that we see in the West. We've done MRIs on them every like 10 years or so.
Oh, wow.
Longitudinal study. Their health is just remarkably better in terms of chronic disease. And it's true their diets are simpler, they're more physically active, but the thing that keeps coming up that looks strangely interesting is the parasites,
Mhm.
because our immune system was always evolved with parasites, right? And we've only gotten rid of them in the last 100 years or so. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of unanswered questions. I don't like to say that that is good for them, but it looks to be something correlated perhaps with a lot of less inflammation related disease, which is what a
Mhm.
lot of chronic disease is. So it's really confusing. And the more you look at these things, the more you go, huh, I don't know. I don't think necessarily what we think we know is necessarily true.
Mhm.
Another thing that's really interesting is if you look around the world, what you should eat and stuff like that almost has something to do with what your ancestors ate, because
Mhm.
we've all evolved
Right.
in different regions with different diets. So it was a real interesting thing that happened in China around 25 years ago. I
Mhm.
was working in China, and China started this huge drink more milk program. They wanted everyone to do it because there are all these studies of white people that showed it was good for you to prevent
I think I know
Alzheimer's
where this is going.
and you know they're all lactose intolerant. So it created I had friends there, and they're all saying, "Well, I feel really uncomfortable after drinking milk, but they tell me it's healthy, so I do it anyway." And I'm like, "Well, don't do it. Don't listen to your damn government." Can I say damn? No. You know what I mean? Or
Mhm.
actually, government's the curse word here, right?
No, of course. Yeah, it's interesting because, and we could riff on this forever, but like, you think about Asia where like Asia's mostly deserts. Do you think they had a lot of cows there? I mean, you can't really,
Well,
what
they
do cows
had
make?
beef. They eat beef,
Yeah.
but dairy was just never part of it. I mean, you
Mhm.
got to think about it. It's like the norm in other species is in chimpanzees and gorillas is to be lactose intolerant. The
Yeah.
new mutation that occurred was something that happened a few thousand years ago in
Mhm.
probably Central Asia, and it came to Europe with nomads.
Mhm.
And so it's because it's a uniquely human perversion to think, let me squeeze this cow and drink its juice.
Mhm.
Cows don't go, wonder what comes out of that pig. Let me drink it.
Right.
The human perversion that we come up with these weird ideas. And so, you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah, and one thing I'm sure you're well aware of, I've had quite a few doctors on the show who have, done research papers and stuff like that. Whenever you talk to people about this, um, people who are ignorant of just like scientific literature and how it's done don't understand that, like, okay, if you want tight controls, like if you want to do a metabolic ward study, it's going to
mm,
be very short because you're telling people you have to stop your entire life and go into food jail, and we're going to watch everything you do to tightly control everything in your life.
yeah.
Most people don't like they're not there's not people just waiting to do this, right? People have
Right.
lives. They don't want to do that. So you're going to get a 2-3 week study and you're going to have to
Yeah.
extrapolate from there. If you want to get like the widest swath of data, you're going to have to keep pretty loose controls, but though, you can still kind of get some information there. You're just kind of
Mhm.
you're not really going to get like a cause, but you're going to get like a trend. Like when I talk to people like LDL stuff, like LDL cholesterol and how it relates to heart disease,
Mm.
for me, it never quite clicked about how LDL isn't necessarily causal, but it's like necessary for the whole heart disease thing until I started learning about Mendelian randomization, where you take people who have similar genetics from birth, similar behaviors, and then watch them over a lifetime and you measure their blood markers over a lifetime. And you see, okay, well, the person who was exposed to higher LDL throughout a lifetime had more CVD than people who had lower LDL throughout a lifetime. And that's when, you kind of have to use epidemiology because you can't tell somebody, hey, I'm going to get blood from you every single month for your entire life. Like that just doesn't happen.
Yeah. I mean, humans are a terrible species to study. I mean, it's
Yeah.
even worse in genetics. I
Mhm.
always say when I teach, I say we work in experiments with inbred mice and
Yeah.
inbred other organisms, and you do mutagenesis on them,
Mhm.
and you raise their kids in cages and see what happens to them, feed them the same child. And you can't really do that in humans. I can't say you and her, I'd like you to give me 10 kids, I'll raise them in cages, and half of them are
Yeah.
going to smoke and the other half aren't. And we'll see what happens over a lifetime.
Mhm.
So humans are just, it's bad. We have to do observational research. And so the other problem is in humans, most research starts with the disease, the outcome.
Mhm.
And you
Right.
take people who are sick, and then you see what's different about them from people who are healthy at old age.
Mhm.
But the problem with that is also that they were exposed to the environment of the last 50 years,
Mhm.
not the next 50 years. And that's changed because as soon as we learn stuff, we change our behavior in response to it. You know,
Mhm.
in our parents' generation, probably 70% of people smoked, and now it's like 20%. Right?
Mhm.
It's a huge difference. The diet has changed and all that. So it's really, really difficult to say with certainty what is or is not good for you and when and in what context in human beings because we can't do the study. And
Mhm.
that makes it really difficult. And we all tend to like overstate our beliefs as if we know they're true. Doctors are the worst at that, because it's their job. They're taught to be authoritative and not to express
Mhm.
doubt. Otherwise, patients don't listen to them. And
Yeah.
I understand that, but it the problem is that we never actually really know these things. Yeah. So, we all talk about the doctors during COVID telling us, you must do this, you must do that.
Mhm.
And I say, yeah, that's not really true because we don't really know and we never really know. But the
Mhm.
problem is if PhDs, people like me made those decisions, we say, I don't know, you could do this, you could do that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because that's usually the right answer, but that's not what anyone wants to hear.
Yeah, it's funny because like all the people who I know that are like the most well read on like muscle hypertrophy research or even like nutrition, they're always like, okay, well, the research suggests or it
Yeah.
seems like this. I think it, most of the research suggests this. There's never any definitive statements. Or if, there is like a solid flag planted, then it's just like, there's just so much, literature just overwhelmingly stating my hypothesis that I feel pretty confident in putting my flag here. But like the vast majority of things, especially in the nutrition world, people are usually like, it kind of seems like this, but we just don't know because, like you said, you can't get a man and a woman and tell them, hey, I'm going to have you breed 10 kids. I'm going to raise them in a cage. And then after 50 years, we're going to cut them all up and then measure their muscle mass, check their arteries and everything. And we're going to check every last little biomarker to figure out exactly what happened, why. You just can't ethically do that. That's not going to pass an ethics board, and people won't do it.
But what we do in humans, it's the reason I work in all these unusual places, is that we can't do experiments, but we look for a natural approximation of an experiment,
right?
Like a certain type of isolation, like what happened with the Koreans being separated, and it makes them different, not by choice. So it would be unethical to do that to them for the purpose of science, but instead we just go look where it's sort of already happened. You'd probably find interesting a study that we've been doing in Finland, where I think people that work out, fitness athletes and powerlifters and stuff, they keep, as you know, very tight records of what they did and how it worked, right? For your training as well as your diet, because they're almost, it's like an experiment on yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so we all understand what it means when we say we all have different genetics, meaning that, well, what works for me doesn't work for you. I have to train short and heavy, right? I can't do the long training because that doesn't work for me. Right. And for everyone, it's different. And we know this only because we keep records and we monitor it. So in Finland, what we were doing was we were working with some people in sports medicine. And the project was to take a group of fitness athletes, off-season, semi-professional kind of amateurs. And we measured them as they trained to get in shape and get their BMI for women down to 12 or 13 for a competition.
Whoa.
And then we'd take fat biopsies along the way, measure everything at different stages so that we get real data about the effects of, basically massive changes in body shape, like yo-yo. It was mirroring yo-yo dieting, but it's very different, right? When you go to the extreme state that you can see every muscle through your skin, right? As you have to for those competitions. But they're a great population to study because they're interested. They're eager to participate. They like that you're measuring all this stuff, so they get more data to figure out themselves and apply in their own practice. So these are all the kind of things that you have to do. And it's part of the reason why there is actually pretty good science behind some of the stuff in lifting, because so many people actually do regulate what they take in and they measure it and they do all this stuff because they want a good result. And we all know how frustrating it is when you do all that stuff and still end up a fat slob like me anyway.
Well, see, this is why when I hear people dismiss science outright, because I understand after 2020, and I'm sure you share this, in common with me, it's like it was sloppy, it was dirty, and I mean there were downright, in my mind, human rights abuses amongst lockdowns and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean you throw out science altogether. That means okay, well, you should always be skeptical and also be skeptical of where it's done. But like you said, when it comes to powerlifting and nutrition and stuff like that, you have objective markers to see something. So if you have an issue with a study, you can read the methods and then read the collection. You can read all this stuff to determine whether or not it was bad or not. You could see if they maybe left something out, or, you could find hey, maybe they didn't collect this little piece of data that might've been important. There's all sorts of things to pick out. And, when people talk about psychological and sociological studies, then I'm kind of okay, well, I understand why you're skeptical of those, because we're talking about subjective markers where if I give you a shot of tequila right now, that may make you puke or it may make you happy as hell. So that's your subjective feeling. Whereas if you lifted 500 pounds, this week, but next week you can only do 450, that's objective data. You didn't do this. You have a marker, or once again, blood markers or body composition. You could tell if somebody's fat-free mass is increasing, or, if they're, certain cells in their fats from when they ate something from a couple weeks ago, if that's now circulating around. I think they call them carbon tracer studies, when they check to verify people are eating how many calories and where the calories are coming from. They're being stored in adipose tissue. So there's all these objective markers. So I get frustrated when I try to share a study with someone who's arguing with me about something and they're oh, that's from the NIH or something like that. It's okay, well, read the methods, and that's who they have to publish it through too.
And I mean, all science in America is funded from NIH and around the world. And I'll be honest, I had wars with Francis Collins, who's the head of NIH,
Uh,
25 years ago about his work in the Human Genome Project, because I was saying this is all nonsense.
yeah.
And it is all nonsense. Now they all agree with what I wrote 25 years ago because it was true. And it turned out to predict what was going to happen. But you know, it's not, I'm not restricted in what I say at all by them.
Mhm.
And I don't feel any obligation to say what they want me to say or not, because I was in your face arguing with him, you know, for years. You know, he hated me. But I mean, the thing is that in science, you do have these debates and you do have these things all the time. And so I don't think who funded it's the issue, but I do notice something. Certainly when it comes to looking at COVID,
Mhm.
and it's something that bothers me a lot, which is that everybody I know who's a scientist, what they believe today about the vaccines, about COVID, about all the data is more correlated with their politics than it is with how many papers they've read.
Mm.
And that's across the spectrum. And I got in trouble during COVID because everyone said I wasn't on their side anymore because I kept reading the papers and changing my behavior.
Right.
You know, I was actually in South Korea when COVID started.
Mm.
And they had their first outbreak while I was there. And one of my colleagues, my friend, he's a medical doctor, and they already dealt with MERS and SARS and these other epidemics. And he handed me a stack of masks. And he said, these don't do anything, but they make other people feel respected. So it's social etiquette. So wear it while you're here because it's social etiquette.
Mm.
And to me, that was enough of a reason that I would wear it, even knowing it didn't do anything. And the reason is that, you know, I've done some work in Chernobyl and Semipalatinsk, which are Chernobyl was the nuclear, you know, thing in Ukraine. And Semipalatinsk is where Russians, the Soviets, detonated something like a few hundred surface nuclear bombs. Right, they were making reservoirs with nuclear bombs as the peaceful nuclear bomb program because they were hoping to redirect Siberian rivers to refill the Aral Sea that went away because they used the water to grow cotton in the desert. Mm-hmm. You know, it's a really great government solution. Yeah, we created a problem. Let's fix it with nuclear bombs. But in both of those places, the data are pretty clear. You know, Chernobyl stayed open for 20 years. There were 3 other reactors at the site. And there were people there every day. And more people died of stress-related disorders than died of radiation. So the fear killed more people than the actual thing they were afraid of.
Oh, wow.
And that seems to be pretty ubiquitous in all of these areas. And I know it's going to mean that someday in America, there'll be a dirty bomb or some accident or something, and people are going to grossly overreact to it out of fear. And that's the danger. So I wrote an editorial at the beginning of COVID saying, my worry is that this is going to be the same thing, that we're overreacting out of fear to something, and the fear may be more dangerous than the actual disease.
Wow.
And I think there's some evidence that we don't know yet where it's going to turn out from all of that. But I mean, people weren't getting checked by their doctor, cancer screenings and other health checkups because they weren't allowed to. That was called elective, you know. A lot of surgery that's elective surgery was canceled. And that doesn't mean boob jobs. That means, you know, stuff that you should have had. Right. So there's a lot of things that were done that way because everyone in power was afraid of screwing up. Because if it went really bad and a lot of people died, they would be blamed for it. Now, the other problem is that you have all these physicians, as I said, making these decisions. And they're taught in medical school, always act like you know what you're doing and don't waver. And so they don't waver. And then when you have a huge bureaucracy like we have, it changes things very, very slowly. So it took forever to undo this. I mean, in Manhattan, we had to wear masks outside until 2022 in the snow in Central Park. And, you know, it's ridiculous. Still about 10% of people on the subway wear them, which I just sort of look at them like, okay.
You okay?
And maybe some of them are probably legit. They have a real immunocompromise or something, and fine. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. As a libertarian, you do you, let me do me. And that was the problem with COVID. It was not so much that, I mean, we're all arguing like we don't like it because the science was bad. Well, I would say I wish that every libertarian wished the vaccine worked. And everyone wished that these protective measures actually did work. Because even if they worked, it's still wrong to force people to do it.
Right.
So, you know, I work in Finland a lot. Now, in Finland, it was really interesting because the government tried to put in mandates on masks and vaccines. But in Finland, every law and every regulation has to pass their constitutional court before it's enacted, not after. So it was found unconstitutional to force anyone to do something medical. So they weren't allowed to have mandates. And that to me, and then what happened as a result is that their government had to be very good at convincing people. So they put the best website in English, even during COVID. Every week or a couple of weeks, they'd update the data. They'd update their suggestions. They'd modify it because they had to earn the trust of the people to get people to do the right thing, whatever that might be. And it's interesting that they encouraged vaccines, but they never let men under 30 get them because they'd already gotten data from us because we did it first. And they realized that the problem outweighed the risk and the benefits. So my attitude is sort of like, I like the technology. I think it's going to be useful for some things in the future. I think it was absurd to force people to put something in their body that could be hazardous.
Right.
When the benefit's so small. It's a cost benefit thing and everyone's got their own calculus. And I certainly don't trust the government telling me what to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, I'm not supposed to curse, so I won't say government anymore.
No, you're yeah. And see, this is another like nuanced point is that like, I think a lot of people in our corner tended to overstate the detriment of the vaccine. And it's like, there were some people who were adversely affected. And I mean, that is just beyond a shadow of a doubt true, but I mean, that's with anything as well. So like in my reading of all the data, and even like if we want to talk about like asymptomatic spread and stuff like that, like even I think it was the CDC came out and said like asymptomatic spread pretty much doesn't happen. I think the WHO also said the same thing. I read a study, I think it was Noam Barda et al. And I think when I kind of did like the calculations and compared it here in Pennsylvania, I think it was like your risk of getting myocarditis from the vaccine was 1 in 32,500. I think that's the risk, which is still infinitesimally small, right? But
it's a lot of people,
yeah. Your risk of getting myocarditis from having COVID was like 1 in like 125,000. If you were under the age of 30, or if you were in the age range of like 18 to 29. These numbers may not be perfect, but if I remember correctly, I think that's around about what it was. Both are significant minorities.
Sure.
But, if you just go by that alone, you're 3 times more likely to have a myocarditis event that could end you in the hospital from getting the vaccine, going by those numbers. So, no, once again, these could be wrong, but that's around about what I got. But still, you're still talking about something that's infinitesimally small. So do with that what you will,
Well, what I always tell people is, I work a lot in Scandinavia, and I certainly don't want us to have a single payer health system.
No.
But one of the advantages of countries that do is that we have data about every encounter every person had with the medical system. So we know every person who got vaccinated, every time they got vaccinated, everyone who got COVID from at least that was tested and shown in the hospital, and all this. So so the only data I trust is like Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, because it's the whole population.
Right.
All the studies that are done in America have the biases of the investigator involved because they had an opinion of what was going to happen and they sampled in a way that
would be favorable to their
model. And that, I think, is part of the reason why most of the people that are biologists who work with COVID, I find that their opinions are more correlated with the politics than with the science. And that bothers me. So I usually rely on what I see over there, even though it is obviously different in many ways. But what I really liked was in Finland, what they did do is they did a study where they took everyone who had the vaccine and reclaimed damage. Like we have this VAERS system in America where everyone reports. They have the same thing there. What they did is everyone that died as a result of this, they sent the same set of forensic doctors to investigate each of them, to look at the medical records, to do the autopsy, to do everything. So they got actual real data. And I know that in Finland, at least, they had something like a few hundred people claimed that the death was due to the vaccine, and they examined them. And what they concluded were that there were 5 that were definitely caused by the vaccine. And there were another maybe 15 or 20 where the vaccine hastened death. So that's still a lot of people, right? That's
Right.
enough reason for me to say, don't force it on me.
Right.
But it's also not, it's a small number out of a population of maybe 3 million people that had been vaccinated.
Yeah.
So, I mean, basically the data looks like, yeah, it is damaging. There are problems, and they never gave it to young men to avoid those problems.
Yeah.
But at the same time, all vaccines have dangers associated with them, as we know. So, I mean, I've gotten it myself, and only because I'm old enough and I'm a little bit fat. So I figured I better safe than sorry. And I had COVID in 2020 really badly.
Okay.
And I was like, it was the first time in my life I said, oh shit, I don't have a will. Because I was that sick from it.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's why I did that. But what I find strange is, like, as you say, in our corner, it's this idea that I'm proud that I didn't get the vaccine, or almost like being happy when someone vaccinated gets COVID. See, it doesn't work. It's that part of it that bothers me. Not because I think it's wonderful. I think the vaccine didn't work very well. I mean, I've still had COVID 6 times, only once was bad, but I had it 6 times. And I only know that because I'm a musician, and we had to be tested within 72 hours of any rehearsal or performance, throughout, from 21 to 23. And we had to be vaccinated, and we had to be updated in our vaccine. So we had to have all that if we wanted to play. And I actually was okay with it for one reason. It was done by the private sector. Because people were so scared to go to shows that the only way you could put butts in seats was to make them feel safe. And this was it's all bullshit. Yeah. But it made the audience feel safe, and the margins are so tight on Broadway and stuff that they can't survive if they don't do that. So that's the reason why it was a private sector decision. It wasn't a government imposition, So.
Yeah, and I agree. It's not really good to cheer the misfortune of others. Yeah. And I always tell people that, like, science was abused in this respect, and like just in this respect alone. So, always be cautious about this kind of stuff. But that's really, I didn't know that about, like, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. But like that stuff is very important. And I mean, like, right there tells you, like, hey, if they sent multiple people, you can kind of get a pretty good idea that your data is not botched, because you have multiple inputs and you're dealing with a wide population that is like a lot of information. So you have a pretty good, like, triangulation of truth there, so to speak. Whereas here it was a lot looser. And, I think it's just people are so quick on this issue in particular to confirm or deny their bias. And like, I get it. I completely understand. But, I really try to advise people against being so, like, contrarian, because if you're a contrarian by nature, you're still being led. You're just being led by people that you hate. You should think for yourself.
Good to question everything. I firmly believe question everything. And I don't believe something because you told me or because I told you. I always tell my students, don't believe this because I said it, because I'm full of shit half the time. You got to convince yourself of something before you do it, But, that was just my thing, is like, I worry that we're forgetting about people have the freedom to wear a mask if they want to. I think it's silly. I hated being forced to do it. And if you want a vaccine, get it. And I hope it works, but when we get, too almost rooting for it to fail, it's almost as bad as the people on the left who were celebrating when Herman Cain died of COVID because he wasn't vaccinated. And I think, but that's just morbid on both sides. And the reason it got this bad had to do with the 2020 election. Both sides tried to politicize it because Trump was in their heads, and it became irrational. I mean, it's weird to me that Trump, he was the one who got the vaccine. He bought America the first 300 million doses, right? So we could get it first. And now he's like, yeah, I'm not pro-vax, and I'm like, well, you're the Operation Warp Speed, dude.
Yeah, it's always funny how people kind of leave that part out.
On both sides, the left won't give him credit and the right won't give him blame.
Yeah. There's always this weird thing surrounding Trump where For guys like us, it's completely obvious to see. It's like, okay, well, yeah, like the coup in Venezuela, the drone
Mhm.
strikes, and all these other things
Sure.
that are like clear as day to criticize him on. But like
Mhm.
the most of the left does not touch that.
Yeah.
They're too busy screaming that he's a racist, a
Yeah.
sexist, a misogynist, shit that's like, first of all, wrong, but like
Yeah.
nobody cares.
Yeah.
That's not what's important. There's way more important things. And then on the right side of the aisle, every time he did something wrong, it was because somebody bad was in his ear. He was
Yeah.
tricked. He didn't know who to trust or this and that. And it's like, he's a human being. He's
Yeah.
accountable for his own actions. He's not perfect. Nobody's perfect. There were some good things that he did, and there were a lot of bad things that he did.
Sure.
And he hired bad people, and
Yep.
he's still hiring bad people. And
Yep.
at the same time, he also hired good people. I mean, he put Jay Bhattacharya at the NIH,
I
which
know.
like you couldn't find a better person for that
I know.
specific job.
I
But
know. I
then
love it.
he puts Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, it's Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State, which are absolutely abysmal picks. It's funny you were talking about Venezuela earlier, and I was talking
Mhm.
to a couple of friends who consider themselves more like hard right, dissident right. And we were talking about Venezuela, and people are all talking about the Venezuelan gangs taking over hotels, which like that's completely wrong. Nobody wants to see that.
Mhm.
But you have to have the conversation of what caused the immigration
Mhm.
crisis, and that was the coup in Venezuela and the brutal sanctions placed on that country
Sure.
by the last Trump administration under with Marco Rubio.
Yep.
And you going to Venezuela, I'm sure you probably know a little bit about the conditions there. And once again, this isn't all the US that did that, but you can't discount that because once again, Venezuela's largest resource is their oil underneath their feet.
Yep.
And the US has officially punished them from, they're basically sanctioned from trading that oil with other countries. So you
They
really
were
put them in
already
a
falling up. To be fair, they were falling apart
yeah,
before that, though, because
right.
their system was they were like almost a narco state where they were just
Mhm.
like selling drugs instead of the oil to support the economy. There's so much
Yeah.
corruption. You know, the oil is amazing. I mean, they should be the richest country in the hemisphere. They got beautiful
Mhm.
harbors there. They've got islands, beaches, best beef I've ever had,
Oh wow.
and
Okay.
oil and everything, and yet just the corruption and everything just
Mhm.
turned it into a basket case. And we were able to collect data starting in the 90s when it was still rich as the society collapsed. So it's the good thing is that at least some people there have a little bit of more positive opinion of America than they might because Americans were there helping them.
Mhm.
And that's what I try to do when I do science in all these difficult places, is to try to basically change how they see us, because they hear caricatures of America, and sure, our government, I always tell, like in North Korea, I always tell the people there that we have one thing in common: we don't like our government either. And I mean, it's kind of true, right? It's certainly libertarians. I said that, the government's a four-letter word.
Mhm.
um, and I mean, when you're there, it's like they see us as people, and you go there to try to show that we're just like they are. We're friendly,
Mhm.
we want to get along, we want to be helpful, and we're good people. And I think that is America's biggest strength, is that soft power. And now we have a huge problem where our government is just gone completely insane in terms of banning like the academic exchanges with the Chinese and the Russians and
Mhm.
the North Koreans and everybody. It's like that's the best thing we can do, is invite them here, let them come here, let as many as want come here, because that's how you change their minds.
Mhm.
You can't live in America and not start to like Americans because we're nice people. Our government, whatever, but we are nice. And I think that everyone I know that spent time living here, for the most part, they have a more positive impression of America than they had before they lived here.
Yeah,
I
and
try to
much
be an
to your
ambassador when I travel. It's like I
Mhm.
want them to think of me as the typical American because I'm nice to people.
Right. Yeah, much to your point, one of the most frustrating things about the whole Biden administration is that really there's been absolutely zero diplomacy with anybody anywhere. And like this was even a frustrating thing for me with like right wingers where they're like, oh, Joe Biden's bought and paid for by China. It's like, well, no, he's really made relations with China so much
Oh yeah,
worse. And like people were talking about they were like memeing it because Trump said that he invited Xi Jinping to his
right.
inauguration. And I'm like, no, this is actually like a good
He's
thing.
not coming, by the way. He can't. He said he's not coming. But
Okay, well, but like regardless, at least the invitation there. Like I said, it's a meme, but at the same time, relations with China are so bad,
yeah,
and same deal with Russia. Relations with Russia are really, really bad. So like anything to get these people to like the table and just talk,
That's right.
have some kind of relationship, because like we don't want to fight a nuclear war. I mean, that ends civilization, especially
Exactly.
with, North Korea, Russia, or China. I mean, those are like and then obviously Iran. Iran doesn't have nukes, but like, those first three countries, it's like we can't go to war with them. Once again, that ends civilization. So anything we could do to kind of get these people to the table, shake
Yep.
hands, and like, the ideal situation should be we export the greatest things about America to
Yeah.
China, to Russia, to North Korea, to Iran, and then, we import the things from them that are great. Like China
Yeah.
has a great electric vehicle,
Sure.
great electric vehicle market. Here in America, we're starting to develop that. So I work for General Motors
Hmm.
as a mechanic, and like we have the EV Hummers, the
Hmm.
EV Cadillac Lyrics. I mean, you cannot drive an EV Hummer and not just be blown. You're talking about a ten
Yeah.
thousand pound Hummer that goes
Mhm.
0 to 60 in 3 seconds. I mean,
Yeah.
it is mind bogglingly awesome. Maybe the Chinese would like that. I'm sure they don't have plenty of big old Hummers over there. So why don't we give them some of those,
Right.
and we'll take their cheap electric cars. And if they're junk, they're junk. But at the same time, they have a warranty. So let's, why can't we trade? Why can't we be friends with these people?
Right. And I mean, especially, in the electric vehicle issue, I mean, China has a lot of the rare earth minerals, and
Yeah.
Afghanistan does. And North Korea may have 2/3 of the rare earths in the world.
Oh, wow.
That's part of the reason the sanctions are so strict, because if they could sell those things, that's like Saudi Arabia rich, potentially.
Wow.
And it's also why a lot of the previous South Korean administrations they talked about unification jackpot, meaning Samsung could get the minerals.
Mm.
But this is a big part of a lot of these things. That's why would anyone care about Afghanistan? It's a bunch of mountains, and the British and the Russians fought over it for centuries, right? In the Great Game, and then we think, oh well, now we'll go do it. I was in Afghanistan in 2011 because we were doing studies of nomads in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan and in Xinjiang, China, and I went into Tajikistan to work with some of the nomads, and we crossed into Afghanistan, and you're sitting there, and these people, they don't even understand why they're being bombed.
Mhm.
These people can't read. They don't have electricity, so they don't have radios. They live in houses built literally out of animal shit. That's what holds it together up there in the top of the mountains. And they're like supporting Taliban. It's like, well, why? They said, well, because they're protecting us from the people that bombed and killed my cousin.
Mhm.
That's very human. It's very obvious that we're, it's like, why are we fighting over this region? And the other thing I noticed when I was there, speaking about genetics and environment, I had a driver, and at one point the water hose broke in our car. There
Mhm.
was a lake about 500 meters down a steep hill. Now we're up at like ridiculous altitude. We're walking on a flat level. I felt like I was climbing a mountain.
Mhm.
And so this guy then just grabs 2 water jugs, runs down the side of this mountain like 500 yards down. It's really steep,
Mhm.
and then fills them with water and runs back up and fills the jug happily without even being out of breath. And I said, that's why we lost in Afghanistan. Home field advantage, gene environment interaction. They're
Yeah.
exposed, trained, and they got the right genes.
Mhm. Oh, that's hilarious. So one thing you kind of mentioned there briefly was the whole situation with North Korea. So
No.
I want to start pretty far out and start to zoom in on kind of
Okay.
like what your relationship was over there. So with most Americans, and I've kind of broken out of this after interviewing somebody that lived in Palestine, somebody that lived in Russia,
Yep.
multiple people that lived in China.
Mhm.
Um, you come to learn that like most people over the world, they're not exactly the same, but like they're people, right? Like they
Exactly.
still eat, they have families, they have things they like to do, they like to go get McDonald's or whatever. They still live a pretty normal life like we would perceive it. And they have their own culture that's a little bit different, but
Yep.
like they still want to take care of their family and their kids and stuff like that. Where, I think the typical Western propaganda is that, like, oh, over in Afghanistan, they behead babies and do all this crazy shit. But it's like, no, they really don't. They may look different over there, but still they kind of have like the same outlook.
Families, if anything, families more important over
Wow.
there,
Okay.
because everyone you live with is your family. You're basically all
Right.
living in the same place in these, in the rural areas, especially, right? And it's more a part of the culture than America. I mean, as a geneticist, one of the reasons we don't do much work in America is because we don't have any families, and we need big
Yeah.
families to do genetics. So, we're better off going to places like that where you have whole families and they all live in the same place.
Right.
So it's definitely like that. Another thing I would say, you mentioned China, for example. I lived in China for a while,
Mm.
and I've always been impressed in China at, we always call China a police state and all these other things, but I
Yeah.
thought in some ways less so than here. And I give an example, which is like, we were all in this we were in this town, Yenji, which is near the North Korean border. There's a bunch of foreigners there studying Korean in China. A long story, but so we go out one night and everyone's drinking, and there's these drunk Chinese guys that were upset because we had one of the women in our group was Asian American, and they thought we were all horning in on their women, as they put it, right? So they got mad and they attacked us, and the woman hit him in the head with an umbrella, and blood started pouring everywhere. So
Dude.
then it just went nuts, and there was fights, and I was actually asleep. I wasn't there for this, so they came and got me because I spoke Chinese. And so we go out, and apparently, and so they basically looked at all the video and everything, and the next day they said to the Chinese guys, look, here's what happened. You guys started it. You pay the medical bills for the guy who got injured and give him, 500 renminbi in money. And everyone cool with that? Cool. Yep. Go home. You're all done. Here everybody be in prison.
Yeah.
Maybe there'd be no cash bail, but it'd be
yeah. And I think that's what people's perception of China is. But I've kind of thought this for a while now, that like really China's kind of more like what America used to be.
Yeah.
And we're more like what we think China is, where people are like, oh,
Yeah.
there's cameras everywhere. They have, I'm sure you're familiar with the whole claims of the Uyghurs being genocide in Xinjiang. And then
I was there the day the riot happened.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, we were doing a study of Kazakhs in China, and I was out living with the nomads in the countryside that summer. And we went back to Urumqi that day, and that's when the riot happened in 2009 that started the whole thing. And they just basically, I was leaving anyway, so they just sent me to the airport, and I flew to Russia where it was safe.
Wow.
But I mean, yeah, it was a mess. I've been back a couple of times since, and it's a lot different now. There's a lot more Chinese there. Demographically, and it's a lot more controlled than it was before, and there are cameras everywhere there now. I mean, people wouldn't talk if we were on the street.
Wow. Yeah. So and I've heard different accounts, but most of them seem to be like, it wasn't always an ideal situation, but there was definitionally no genocide. It was just more like there were some people who were in rough shape there, but they did do some legitimately bad things. And like when I say this almost sounds like, the way people may talk about like Israelis talking about Palestinians. It's not like that. It's just like, hey, these people weren't necessarily a part of this culture, and they did have some internal issues, and they had camps. It wasn't like these people were being held at gunpoint or anything, but like they did want them to kind of be welcomed into their society. And once again, not that any of this was perfect, but it wasn't as bad as the world made it out to be. Where my understanding now is like more nowadays, it's a little bit more laid back, and it's not anywhere near as bad. My one friend, Jason Smith, who I had on the show, who lives in China, said he's like, it's a very cultural area. He's like, the people there are very friendly, and he painted a pretty rosy picture where it seemed almost a little too optimistic. But I think the Western perception of Xinjiang is that it's like this prison town and death camp, but that doesn't seem.
Yeah, it's not like that. I mean, but it's also not. It's not wonderful if you're the minority. So in China, basically, there's two fundamental rules that you have to accept. Otherwise, they will make your life difficult. And those are, number one, I want to be Chinese. I don't want to secede from China. I may be a minority, but I'm Chinese first. And the Koreans, for example, were cool with that, and that's why they didn't have any restrictions on their behavior. In fact, minorities in China didn't even have the one-child rule that was only for Han Chinese.
Oh,
so it was quite liberal in some ways. But the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, they were like the last to be absorbed in China. They were still having wars with the Soviets in the 70s, kind of over borders and things. And so that is a bit rawer. Because they're also more different because they're basically Turkish Muslim tribes, And I had a great time spending the summer with them as they followed their sheep around in the mountains, living in yurts and everything. And they're really wonderful people, but they really didn't want to be Chinese. And so
Mm.
for China, that was the thing, is like, for China, it's national stability was really important. And so they would
Right.
do what they had to do to prevent outliers from
Any
destroying
instability.
national stability, basically.
Yeah.
So we value individual freedom over everything else, and there it's stability and that sort of thing over everything else. And so
Mm.
anything that threatens stability, yeah, they're a little bit harsh about it.
Okay.
And in their mind, it's the way they preserve, stability.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that was kind of key to this is that the claim of a Uyghur genocide was also about, this is where their Belt and Road Initiative would kind of meet for like a lot of their
Yeah.
gas stuff. So,
Yeah.
and those Uyghur Muslims were also trained in Syria at one point. So there was a lot of reason for the U.S. to want to stoke tensions in this specific region. And like you said, China's looking for stability. The U.S. respects individual autonomy, but also the U.S. has an incentive to knock China off the
And create
potential.
instability as well. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And it's like China had hoped that they were going to use, because they have Kazakh minority, Tajik minority, Kyrgyz minority. They wanted, because they speak the language, they wanted to use them as a bridge. So they were relaxing the
As
controls
like
in
an olive
Xinjiang because they
branch.
really wanted that to be the engagement for the Belt and Road with those countries. And then it got out of control, and they realized that wasn't necessarily the right approach. So they backed off and clamped down on things. I mean, most of my Kazakh friends who I'd spent that summer with ended up in Kazakhstan, because it was
A little rough.
Yeah.
Okay. So this kind
And
of
I say
gets
that,
me.
and I'm not criticizing China, because I understand that they have a bigger problem than we do with 1 point whatever billion people
Right.
trying to maintain something that is some semblance of stability is very difficult with that many people. It's not the way I would do it, but it's their country and it's not my business, necessarily.
Exactly. And I think
I would also say that the word genocide is perhaps the most abused word in the language. Everything's a genocide now, and it's used so often that it makes real genocide seem meaningless.
right.
Because everything's a genocide. The Uyghurs, it's a genocide, and Palestine's a genocide, and everywhere is a genocide. Everybody's a victim of genocide, and no, they're not trying to destroy entire ethnic groups today. They're not trying to kill everybody. It's not genocide. And so we just need to, there's too much license. It's like everybody's a Nazi. Trump's Hitler. It's like, come on, everybody's Hitler now. And it used to be that as soon as you called someone Hitler, you lost the argument.
Right now, it doesn't really have any kind of staying power anymore, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. But at the same time, people are still going to abuse that button, and it's the same deal with crying anti-Semitism now, where
Yeah.
any criticism of Israel is
Right.
automatically anti-Semitism
Because it gives you more power. When you use those
exactly.
words, it shuts people up because nobody wants to be called that.
Nobody wants to be a racist. Nobody wants to be an anti-Semite or anything like that. So it's
Even though
meant to shut down.
everybody's a racist.
It's
In a
always
sense,
meant.
you have to be, because everybody makes, when you see somebody on the street, you make an initial decision based on age, sex, race, size, about how you interact with people, the clothes they wear. And if you claim you don't, you're lying. And if you convince yourself that you don't, then you're lying to yourself. And that's the worst kind of lying, right? I mean, most of the people that go around calling Trump a racist have probably never had a person of another race in their house as a guest.
Right.
And I just laugh when these people, because I like Trump. I'm not a Republican at all, but I liked him because he was tearing up the system, right? Or at least he said he was going to.
Right.
So I like that. And everyone said, "Oh, so you're a racist?" I said, well, that makes zero sense,
Yeah. It's always hilarious, and especially because like now his current administration is mostly like Indian people. And once again, not that that's neither here nor there, but it's
Yeah.
funny, the racist is staffing his administration. I joked it looks like he went to like his local strip mall and went into Dick's and then found all the guys who work behind the gun counter, and then went to the Quickie Mart around the corner to find the rest of them.
Sure.
But okay, so North Korea, I think the Western perception of North Korea is akin to the China perception, where It's a totalitarian government where every single person cannot criticize the government because their neighbor's going to snitch on them. And then if you snitch on the government, you're going to be put out in the field and shot in the back of the head. I think that's how most people interpret North Korea. Um, and that like the people are starving and it's very, 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 very bad over there. I don't know what the exact truth is, and I'm guessing some of the audience doesn't necessarily know either. So, how would you describe it when you've went over there?
Well, you don't have individual freedom. You need permission to do things that we would consider normal things, like visit someone's house or
Mhm.
go to the store, or things that you want to do. You have to get permission. It's highly controlled. In their minds, they're living under kind of martial law because they see themselves as being kind of at war
Mhm.
with the West, and sanctions are, kind of war by other means,
Right.
and so there is problems with the economy, and there are people in the countryside that don't get as much food as they'd like. I mean, we had some students at the university where I teach who said they chose to come to that university because you get all the rice you want,
Oh,
and
wow.
you could eat as much as you wanted. So there are issues, and we'd have meat every 2 weeks because there's not a lot of meat and things available for regular people. So there are issues, and part of the reason is that North Korea is mostly mountains. They have all the rare earth minerals in them,
Mhm.
and South Korea got most of the farmland. So they were the agricultural backwater when the Korea separated. It was only in the late 70s that it started to surpass North Korea economically. But the sanctions kind of make it all worse. They really hurt the normal people a lot
Mhm.
more than they hurt Kim Jong Un. He has a nice fancy house. He's got all the luxuries that he would want. It's the average person that's suffering,
Mhm.
and I mean, it is poor. They have cars that burn wood, trucks that burn wood. It was
Mhm.
something the Germans developed in World War II when they didn't have access to oil. And it's called an invert generator, and it burns the wood. It makes a wood alcohol that powers the internal combustion engine. So yeah, they have problems. They can't get fuel. I mean, they're sanctioned from getting fuel. Hopefully Russia's alleviating that a little bit, because that's really hurting the normal person there. So
Mhm.
yeah, there are issues about food. There is an issue of poverty. And the problem is that I and you, as libertarians, I presume, think
Mhm.
that planned economies are kind of stupid.
Right.
And yet, and that's our the attitude is, well, your system's stupid, that's why you're poor. But they can blame the sanctions very effectively, because they try to buy anything and it's sanctioned. I mean, at one point we went to a ski resort in North Korea and there was no snow, and Kim Jong-un made the joke. He says, I see you guys even sanction snow now. Because
Wow.
it was getting bad. So, you know, and the problem with this is, like, we make trading everything they trade, it's illegal, right? By the sanctions law. So then if everything's illegal, why not trade the most illegal stuff? Because the profit margins are higher.
Right. And it's
And
the only thing you
that's
could
where
trade.
you get into danger when you're dealing with a country that has nuclear technology.
Mhm.
They don't want proliferation because they also understand the reasons why you don't want certain people to have it. But
Mhm.
if you push and you push and you push, they got to eat somehow, you know. So I think that I mean, it is a totalitarian society, right? They're living under martial law because they are under attack, basically,
Mhm.
by basically the whole world at this point, because the UN sanctions are pretty comprehensive, and it's a problem.
Mm.
And it puts them into a place where they're really defensive, and what they really want, they're not a threat to anyone. They're not going to invade South Korea. That's absurd, right? If
Mhm.
South Korea removed all their military from the DMZ and put up passport control booths, they'd probably run farther away, because they don't want their people listening to South Korean music or watching South Korean movies, or
Mhm.
they certainly don't want them talking to South Koreans. I mean, the South Koreans that were at our institute in North Korea, they, were more controlled because they spoke Korean and they were Korean, that they really didn't want people to interact with them too much.
Mhm.
I was a little bit different. I speak Korean, but I'm not Korean, so they didn't quite know what to do with me. So they just didn't worry about it.
Mhm.
But yeah, so I mean, the idea that they're a threat to anyone is silly unless they're attacked. So I mean, they want nuclear weapons. You know, at one point I was there with Dennis Rodman, and he asked Kim Jong Un, "What's up with the nukes?" And his answer was, "Well, Gaddafi gave up his nukes. You killed Gaddafi." Saddam Hussein let weapons inspectors in this country, and they just told you where to bomb. You know,
Mhm.
Pakistan, on the other hand, had your number one enemy, Osama bin Laden, and you didn't try to change their regime. You didn't invade, and you didn't have a war there. Because
Mhm.
I learned my lesson. I'm not stupid.
Yeah, it's funny that literally all the US does is tell countries pretty much that, hey, if you have nukes, we'll leave you alone. And
Right.
I mean, look how it's worked out for Russia. Look how it's worked out for,
Yep.
like you said, Pakistan, North Korea, China. I mean, yeah, we've tried to sanction the fuck out of them, but they're also, they're not getting bombed. So,
Yeah,
if
and,
we,
and, and, and the problem is we're sanctioning everybody.
yeah,
When you
a third
sanction
of the whole
Russia,
planet.
China, North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, what are you going to do? You
Mhm.
created a new trading bloc
Yep.
because they're not going to voluntarily say, okay, fine, I won't trade with anyone. I'll starve to death. No, they're not stupid, right? They're going to trade with each other. And then we can, hey, you can't do that. I mean, when there was a time last year when Russia was allegedly bought weapons from North Korea and ammunition, right? And what was the US response? We complained to Russia for violating sanctions on North Korea, and we complained to North Korea for violating sanctions on Russia. I'm like, hello, how stupid are you people?
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean, they're human beings. And I mean, it's like we put all this punishment on them and we don't put ourselves in their shoes and say, well, what would I do if they did that to me? Like, well, I'd trade with this guy. Exactly.
Mhm. Right. And I was trying to explain this to somebody on Twitter today, and it amazed me that they didn't get it. And they're like, "Oh, well, what do you mean poor Venezuela?" And I'm like, "Well, we have punished them from really doing anything. So, we can't expect them to maintain goodwill, and you can't expect their population, which once again, these sanctions, like you were just saying, they don't hit the government, they don't hit the elites, they're not hitting the people that you want to suffer. They're
Right.
hitting the average person.
That's right.
So how can you expect Venezuelans to just be like, well, I guess the US just completely destroyed my country? And once again, not just the US, but
Yeah.
more recently over the last 4 or 5 years, there's just been heavy sanctions on them. How, what can you blame them for saying, all right, well, fuck it, I'm going to leave and I'm going to go somewhere. And hey, the US is saying, hey, come here. And then what do? They go to, South Florida, and then they get this whole new political group. And what does that political group say? Hey, let's go commit regime change in Venezuela.
Hmm.
And I, I can't fault the people. I don't think they should come here, but at the same time, if we want them to stop coming here, take the sanctions off, make their quality of life a little bit better,
Yeah.
or just tell them, hey, you can't come here. We're leaving your country alone. You guys can't come here anymore. Like that has to be it. If you can't have both. You can't have brutal sanctions on a country that ruin the average person's quality of life and then expect them to just do nothing about it. And once again, I'm not saying that somebody had accused me of saying, "Oh, that just means we get unfettered immigration here." No, I'm saying leave them alone. Quit
Yeah.
giving an incentive to come here. Eliminate the incentive, and then you know tell them they can't come anymore.
I mean, we're pushing them to come here.
Exactly.
And we're doing this everywhere. I mean, it's almost like in North Korea, the policy is designed to promote them trying to leave. And they
Mhm.
don't want to leave. You know, it's just like nobody wants to leave home, right? Their family's there. Everything they love is there. It's not like, defectors are the anomaly, right? And they also have they're uniquely disaffected in any country for the most
Mhm.
part, right? You talk to Soviet defectors and compare what they tell you to what Russians who stayed behind tell you
Mhm.
about what life was like in Soviet Union. And you get a totally different picture because, well, you and I are probably the ones who would be defectors because we're libertarian and we don't like rules. Yeah, but 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 most people care more about being there and helping their own country, no matter how bad they hate it, right?
Right.
That's just human nature.
Right.
It's like I always say it's like, we as libertarians are like the kids who leave mom's house when we're 18 because we want to be on our own,
Yeah.
independent, and not live under her rules, even though we love her,
Mhm.
right? whereas the socialists are the ones that stay in their mom's basement till they're 50 and like it, even though they don't have any freedom. Say, fine, but I don't have to work either.
Right. Somebody in the comments wanted to know, what does Joe think about Yeonmi Park's story, if you're familiar with her?
Well, I mean, again, this is the same thing. It's like the people who did defect are not a random sample of the population, right? They're obviously disaffected. And there's another issue that's kind of important, is that when you grow up in North Korea, you're growing up in a society where truth is political, and you understand that from birth, right? That what you say is true has to be, what you're supposed to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when you end up in a new society, it's natural to take the same approach. And a lot of the defectors that you hear the most publicly are the ones that say what South Korea, US wanted them to say, and they're rewarded for that in the same way they would have been rewarded in North Korea for saying the right thing. So I think there's a huge element of that leads to significant exaggeration in a lot of these stories, because they're a curated group of people that do most of the speaking, about this. And as I said, I'm as a scientist, I work as an epidemiologist, and we always know that there's a big problem in studying migrant populations, because people self-select for migration, and that makes them not representative, right? They're different in some fundamental way. As I said, you and I, if we were living in a society where they tried to tell us what to do, we would probably leave. Because we'd be so driven to get the hell out of there that we would. Right? That's why a lot of libertarians are in New Hampshire, right?
Yeah, exactly. So
they're kind of defectors from New York and California.
Yeah. One story that you told on Kyle's show, and he had mentioned Ron Paul. We talked about this briefly last week. Was about what was it called, like a baseball diplomacy or sports diplomacy, where you kind of played some kind of sports, or even like in your case, I think engaged in some kind of like scientific research with another country as some sort of diplomacy. Do you think that's reliable? And do you think that's a good development? And like, how has that worked for you?
Well, I mean, science, sports, music, academics, these are things that don't have to be politicized, and because everyone enjoys music, right? Everyone likes sports, basketball. The Olympics, what were the Olympics for in the first place? It was Athens and Sparta were at war with each other, right? And so they said, well, let's just get together, we'll stop the war for a while and play some games. And I think that's a genuine human thing that people like to do, right? So when we went and played, we took a team of NBA players to North Korea. And the best part of that game, they played a half where it was North Korea against US, and North Korea killed them, because the North Koreans were young and fast, and they could shoot 3-point shots all day, whereas the Americans were old and sluggish and taller, but they won. But it was kind of boring. The second half, they had two teams. Each team was half North Koreans, half Americans. And then you had both on the same team, and they were working together, and it was much better game. It was more fun to watch. And these basketball players then spend a day together, going to water parks and other things, just relaxing as normal people. And they understood each other because they're athletes. They're the same. And the same thing works with musicians. I mean, when I was in college, I went to music school. I went to Peabody Conservatory of Music for undergrad. And our orchestra went to the Soviet Union at the time. It was 1987. And they were one of the first student groups to go there. And they stayed at the homes of the students from Moscow Conservatory, Leningrad Conservatory. And again, you could play music together, and you get to know each other as people, and it changed the way people saw each other. In science, it works the same. One of the most successful, I've done a few delegations to North Korea with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And they, at one point, they had one of the first projects that led to paper with co-authors from the US, the UK, and North Korea, which was, they were studying a volcano that's the sacred mountain in North Korea on the border with China. And so they were putting seismometers around the countryside and doing joint work to try to understand what was going on with this volcano. And it led to high-profile publications with Americans and North Koreans working together. These are all good things, like Apollo-Soyuz, when they went together in outer space during the height of the Cold War. This is all good stuff. and nobody's hurt by it. I mean, there's no way someone can say that because people went there to study a volcano, you're giving them something and it's a reward. No, it's people doing human things. And the scientists understood each other because they have the same expertise, the same scientific culture. This is a good thing. I teach human genetics at the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. I did for many years. And that's a university run by Americans, all volunteers. Mostly, a lot of them are retired and retired Korean Americans who may have roots in the North or something, but they're people that wanted to go there and do something nice. And so we would go there and teach, and we'd live on campus with the students. And so we'd eat with them, we'd talk to them all the time and really build relationships with them as human beings. They see us differently as a result. We're not the caricaturish Americans who are trying to kill them and destroy their country, which, by the way, we did a pretty good job of in the Korean War. Let's not forget that. Right. It's not without reason that they're a little bit, that we're not their favorite people. But you can get along with them. You learn to see them as human beings, and you live the way they live. We'd shop at the same stores and we'd eat the same stuff. And, you really start to humanize each other. And I mean, part of the problem with North Korea especially is that all you see in the news is caricatures, right? And it's dehumanizing characters, like they're robots ready to march and kill and destroy the world. And you go there and everybody's like, hi, how are you? And they're this innocence of children almost. Because much like the guy that lives in his mom's basement, he doesn't have any responsibility. So he's like, hi. And, it's like their outcome in life is the government will say, well, here's your house, here's your, whatever, your stuff, do this and follow these rules and all that. But then you don't make choices. Right. And that would be bad for a libertarian. But for the kind of person, for a lot of people, it's a lot easier that way. Because making freedom's hard, right?
It is.
It's a lot of work and personal responsibility for everything that happens to you. Whereas there, it's kind of like, well, we're all in this together. And, oh, well, I don't have anything, but neither does anyone else. So whatever, So it's a very different sort of way of life in a way, And I have a very hard time imagining or trying to convince myself, as I would have liked to have as a libertarian. Because as a libertarian, for me, the interesting part about North Korea is it's the least libertarian place on earth. Right. And it's like I'm also a mathematician. And in math, you often say, well, what if I'm wrong? Assume the opposite and see what happens. Right. And it turns out they get some things right, actually. One of them is, the root of communism is the same as community. And so everybody there are in these social networks and they all know where they fit. And whereas in East Germany, everybody was kind of looking after each other and snitching on each other. In North Korea, it's like they're all protecting each other in a way from the system. So they're like, it's like when a student cheated in class, I kind of knew who it was. Everyone else would take the blame because they didn't want that guy to get in trouble. Because no one wants anyone to get in trouble because someone gets in trouble, it's one less person in your work group. Right. And also, I look out for you, you look out for me. And so they're really tightly knit in their social networks and their friends, because you really have to trust people to open up to them, especially in that kind of place. So I think it actually builds stronger connections between people. So when they talk to people who've defected to South Korea, their biggest complaint is they feel isolated. They feel like they're forced to be on their own, and they have no sense of no one's on their side. They don't have this network. And I think it's something that's weird about everywhere in the world in urban living in America. Like, I don't know the names of the people that live in the next apartments, right? In Manhattan, that's the way it is for the most part. I might recognize them if I see them, but I don't know them. Right. Whereas as a species, we were always tribal, a couple hundred people, whatever. Everybody knew who everybody was. You knew where you fit. You knew your role in society. You knew everybody else's role. And you all lived with each other and got along with, you had to get along with each other, or you get eaten by wildebeests or, whatever. Right. So I think that they got that right. And that's the reason why I look at it. And I look at South Korea. And South Korea is rather libertarian in a sense. It's all every man for himself, make a lot of money, work really hard, get ahead.
Mhm.
They have the highest suicide rate in the OECD countries. And they're also the largest consumers of plastic surgery in the world. I mean, there's more plastic surgeons in Seoul than anywhere. And
Wow.
it's because everyone is supposed to be identical, because there's certain things that every woman's supposed to look a certain way. I mean,
Yeah.
men there wear more makeup than American women.
Oh, wow.
Because they're all supposed to look perfect and be perfect. And the stress just drives them crazy. And in North Korea, there's a lot of problems. There's food issues, there's money issues. But in the Pyongyang, at least, they're all kind of okay, right? They're middle class. They have cell phones. They do what they got to do. But they don't have stress, because if you work really hard, you might get noticed, and getting noticed is not a good thing, right? You don't want to stand out, because then you can get slapped down, and you don't really want to get slapped down. So it's very relaxed. Like, people do the minimum they have to do to not, get in trouble, but they do enough so that, they get what they need, and they don't really stress about it. Like, the professors at the university play ping pong half the day, they get done what they have to get done. I also think that, like, there's a guy who's probably supposed to be monitoring our email and stuff, because we had unrestricted internet there. And I'm guaranteeing you that he spent all day playing computer games. He did not want to find anything, because if he found anything, it's more work.
Right.
And so I always joke, I never met anyone who's a member of a workers' party that worked.
That is pretty funny.
It's the libertarians who work, because we work and we rewarded for our effort. They're not rewarded for hard work. So there's no incentive to do it.
Yeah, as to where we look forward to the meritocracy of things. We're like, okay, well, no, we want paid for an honest day's work, and we want to work for our own upkeep.
Because we're different. But I think I used to think everybody wanted what we're selling, and they just didn't know it yet. As time goes on, I start thinking, well, maybe they don't want what we're selling, because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And it's a lot easier to stay in your mom's basement until you're 50. And that's something I got also from looking at North and South Korea, because South Korea, you have to work really hard to get anything, but you can get a lot. And in North Korea, how hard you work is not really correlated to what you have.
Yeah.
And I genuinely don't think North Koreans are less happy than South Koreans. I might even say it's the other way around.
Wow.
Because happiness comes from your family and your friends and your social circles. It doesn't come from stuff. Even I say that as a libertarian, I could get shot in the head for saying that, right? but in a way, there's a truth to that. And it's also what we want. We want our stuff for our family, our friends, and our group. And we're very tight with each other,
Yeah, so I guess I want to move forward to how was Kim Jong-un himself, and what was that like, kind of meeting him and being able to spend time with him? Because once again, to go back to the Western perception, I think some people think about it wasn't Pineapple Express, but it was the one movie, I think, with Ashton Kutcher, where they painted him as just some kind of goofball. And I think a lot of people remember the old Trump meme of, oh, little rocket man, your red button doesn't work, but mine actually does. I think people kind of look at that and think that, like, Kim Jong-un is kind of like this little goofball, unserious kind of person who could blow up the entire world if he wanted to.
That's also what they thought about Trump.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, fair enough.
And by the way, when Trump met Kim Jong-un, he gave him the Rocket Man CD.
He really did.
He said, by the way, this is what I was talking about. It's a good thing. And he already, of course, knew anyway.
Yeah.
The thing is that Kim Jong-un's a smart guy. The first time I met him, we met Rodman, of course. I was there. So I didn't explain how I got there, I guess. Like, I was in North Korea teaching when Dennis's first basketball game was on TV there, where he first met Kim Jong-un. And he basically, the students all came to me and said, wow, this is amazing. We saw this strange looking American saying nice things about our country and about our leader, and it's making us reevaluate our stereotypes of Americans. And that's why I said, this is great. I got to get involved in this, because it's the same thing I was trying to do. And so I won a charity auction to play horse with Dennis Rodman
Mhm.
online. It cost me $2,500, and I went there and I played horse with him, and we just talked about North Korea, and he wanted to go back, didn't know how to go back, and I knew the people at the embassy here, so we worked out something with a friend of mine in China who was a Canadian in China, and we worked out all the arrangements for him to go back, and we all went back because Kim invited him for vacation, so we all went on the vacation at Kim's house, basically. And he was very friendly, very nice. I mean, he had Rodman riding horses that Putin had given to his father, to Kim Jong-il, and they smoked a bunch of cigars that Castro had given to his father, and all this sort of stuff. He had the Spice Girls of North Korea, the girl band. He had them on a banana boat. He was driving and knocking them off the boat and stuff, and it was pretty fun. Everybody went out on jet skis with him as well and stuff like this, and it was just like being friendly and socializing. But he was very smart, and his sister as well. His sister was very organized and had everything planned for what was going on in the trip. And like he would, every time something would happen, he'd come up with a joke in like 3 seconds that would be responsive to what had happened. And that's why I say he's a smart guy, because you have to be pretty smart to come that quickly. Like
Right.
one time Rodman asked him, "Have you ever been to Hawaii?" Of course not, right?
Right.
And he just looked at Rodman and goes, "My missiles are aimed at Hawaii." and Rodman goes, "You gonna give me a heads up?" He goes, "Oh, don't worry. My missiles are very smart. They know what you look like, and there's a camera on front. So if they go to Hawaii and you're at the beach, they'll go to the ocean."
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, it's the spontaneous nature of his sense of humor that makes it clear that he's an intelligent person, and he knows about the world, and he can, come up with that stuff really fast. And he did that on many occasions, stuff like that.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's probably why him and Trump probably got along so well, is because Trump is famous for those kind of remarks, little Marco and all the names that he came up with in the 2016 debates. And it's honestly kind of why I was upset about about Trump not doing the 2024 debates. Like, I understand why he didn't, just because it didn't make any sense. But at the same time, to just hear him, come up with names for people, or throw jokes out in the air, he's great at it. He's hilarious. And from what I'm getting from you, it seems like Kim Jong-un kind of had that same gift.
Well, I was actually with the ambassador in New York. They have an embassy, a UN mission in New York. And I was with two of the ambassadors the day after Trump won the election, because we had a previously scheduled meeting, because I had just gotten funding for an exchange program between Columbia University and Kim Il-sung University in North Korea. And we were going to do student and faculty exchanges, which ended with Trump's travel ban, so don't get the idea that I'm not critical. I can be very critical of a lot of things, but I agree with Trump on maybe 60% of issues, which is more than any other president we've ever had. So that's why I'm going with him. So I was with the ambassador that day, and they just looked like they'd overdosed on Prozac because they were so happy that Trump won the election. Even though Trump was saying nasty things about them, they're kind of like, no, we understand this, because they speak the same language. If you've ever read their statements or their newspaper, it kind of sounds like a professional wrestling pregame show, right? The KCNA. And Trump's the same way. He's in the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame. So they actually kind of understand that, and they like that. They got him, right? Because they're kind of, in some ways, they're both undiplomatic in their choice of words, right? I mean, aren't they the ones that called him a dotard? And everyone in America is like, what the hell does that mean? And they looked it up, and they're like, that's good. So I think on that level, they got each other in a way. The other thing I would say is when we got back from meeting Kim Jong-un the first time, we've been there several times together, me and Dennis. We went to North Korea 4 times together. But the first time when we came back, Trump was the only one that wanted to talk to Dennis. Obama administration, because Kim gave us this phone number, and he said, tell Obama to call me. Right? And basically his administration told us to fuck off. But Trump and Dennis were old friends, because Dennis was on Celebrity Apprentice.
Yeah.
And they'd also known each other since the 80s,
Yeah.
through different sports related things. And so Trump called Dennis to Trump Tower, and he said, "Man, this is great. Anything you do to talk to them is better than shooting at them. I'll get Obama to call. I'll give me the number. I'll make sure he does it." And then he said, obviously, told Trump to fuck off, right?
Mhm.
So I think for Trump, this was something he'd always been talking about, even back in the 70s and 80s. There's interviews of Trump where he's saying, "What are we doing with North Korea?" He says, "We just keep, sanctioning them and threatening them with military, and that's not working. How long do you have to keep doing something before you try something different?"
Right.
You know, and he wants, so what if he wants to build hotels there? I don't care what his motive is. He wants to get along with these people,
Right.
I mean, he genuinely is the first president in my lifetime who didn't start a war.
Mhm.
That's a low bar, but it's a pretty significant one, right? He genuinely wants to get along with all these other countries because he wants to do business there.
Mhm.
That's his way of thinking. And so I think the North Koreans understand that. But what they said this summer, when there was some talk about this, they said, there's good personal relationship between our leader and their leader. The problem is that the U.S. doesn't keep its word when the administration changes. And so we can't make a deal just based on their goodwill for each other.
Mhm.
It has to be something that's going to last when the regime changes.
Right.
As they always say to me, they say, look, we're always the same. If we don't like what's happening, we just wait 4 years or 8 years and you
Yeah.
guys change. But
Mhm.
the problem is that every time we change, we break all the deals we make with rogue nations. If you
Mhm.
just look at, like, Bill Clinton almost opened an embassy in Pyongyang. He had this deal where they were gonna shut down their nuclear reactor in exchange for us building light water reactors and giving them fuel oil in the interim.
Yeah.
And then Bush slow walked it and eventually made up an excuse to get rid of it. So we never delivered. Then you got Bush, who made the deal with Gaddafi. You give up your weapons, we'll give you security guarantees. And the Obama administration killed Gaddafi, right? Then you got Obama makes the JCPOA deal with Iran,
Mhm.
and Trump kills that. So
Right.
it's a bipartisan clusterfuck. Every deal we make with countries we don't like, we break.
Mhm.
Now, they don't trust us. And they have reasons not to trust us because there have been all these attempts at negotiation and they feel like they get screwed every time. Bill Clinton removed sanctions, but then Bush put them back. It's like he keeps relaxing and tightening, and they never feel like they get anything out of it. Like, they make compromises and then we don't honor it. And
Mhm.
we obviously don't trust them either for a lot of good reasons, right? We all understand why we don't trust them, but I don't think Americans necessarily understand why they don't trust us because we're the good guys, right? We're always the good guys.
Yeah.
But not in their eyes because we haven't honored these arrangements. And yeah, you can say, well, it wasn't ratified by Congress or this or that. That doesn't mean anything to someone who's in a state where one person can make all the decisions.
Mhm.
It's kind of like, when we got back from doing this basketball game in North Korea, the basketball players all suffered enormously because of the pressure from the government and the criticism that they received for doing this, for playing a game with the enemy. They were obviously traitors. And this is, you know, this is obvious, it's public, right? What's happening to Dennis is like he has lost his reputation at this point.
Mhm.
And I met a North Korean friend of mine in China. And he said to me, he goes, America goes around the world telling other countries they need freedom of speech. Where was Dennis's freedom of speech?
Wow. Yeah.
And the thing is that for them, there's no difference between a government sanction or a private sector sanction because there's no private sector.
Right.
Here, we think cancel culture is compatible with free speech,
Mhm.
and they were canceled. And that's not really compatible with free speech if you're coming at it from their perspective.
Right. Huh. So I guess we've been going for almost 90 minutes and it feels like it's been like 2 seconds because this has just been an awesome conversation. Maybe we could kind of start to wrap up with
Okay.
what do you think the next 4 years contain for diplomacy with North Korea? Do you think things are going to get better? Do you think they're going to get worse? And do you think you'll have a part in it?
I mean, I think that there's a potential in the sense that President Trump and Chairman Kim have a friendly relationship with each other, right? But I also think the biggest problem is that North Korea and Russia got married this summer.
Mm.
They signed all these mutual defense pacts because, I always think of it this way. North Korea always was, juggling between China and Russia, and they always wanted a good deal with America because we're the big dog, right?
Right.
And they respected America. They didn't care too much about deals with South Korea because they didn't even sign the armistice in the Korean War. It was the UN and the US signed it, and the North Koreans signed it for their side. So they want to deal with the US. They've always wanted that. But now they felt like they're trapped into a corner when the South Korean regime, the current South Korean regime, was really being militaristic and restarting all these exercises and openly calling North Korea the number one enemy, saying they wanted to use deterrence against the North Koreans and that they were treating them as the hostile neighbor. And that was a big change from what it had been before. And so that led the North Koreans to say the same thing about the South Koreans, to destroy all the roads leading to the South and say, look, we'll even take it out of our constitution, the idea that we're the government of all Korea. We are now only our own country. We don't want to unify with South Korea. We're too different. We're not going to try. And they removed it. And the idea was now that we're going to be two states on the peninsula that are currently at war with, currently hostile to each other, but we have no interest in taking over, right? But South Korea, they doubled down under the new administration in saying they wanted 통일 대한민국, and 대한민국 is South Korea, is the name for South Korea, and 통일 is unified. So they want to unify under South Korea as a democracy, and that's become their official stated policy. So this is the opposite, right? They're saying we want to take you over, and North Korea is saying we want nothing to do with you. So this is creating a difficulty between North and South. Now, the current South Korean president is on the ropes. We don't know what's going to happen exactly, but it's pretty clear he's not going to survive his term. Mm-hmm. And when he's gone, it'll probably be replaced by someone from the other side, which could make an environment on the South Korean side more amenable to this sort of negotiation. But the reason North Korea allied formally with Russia was because South Korea was declaring them as the enemy, saying we want nothing, that we want to invade and we want to take over. So in this defense pact with Russia, and by the way, it's more than defense. They've had ministers of sports and culture and science and academics have all signed agreements, trade, everything in the last few weeks. So it's been a full-on blitz of engagement with them, like a real kind of marriage, because both sides don't have any other allies. They're the only real ally each one of them has. And North Korea sent then troops into Kursk area in Russia. They're not in the disputed parts of Ukraine, but they're in Russia and allegedly supporting the removal of Ukrainian invaders from Russian territory. And in some way, I think the North Koreans are hoping that they have some casualties, because that would be a blood debt from Russia and an honor, that they would then owe to do the same. And what North Korea really wants is a commitment from Russia that if South Korea tries to invade them, that they will come to their aid, at least to the current border. I don't think any North Korean troops will go into Ukrainian territory, just as they're trying to send a signal that Russian troops, if they had to come to North Korea's defense, would only go to 38th parallel to the current border. So that's big for North Korea's sense of security, that Russia will help them not be taken over. And I think that this is the new calculus, that it used to be that North Korean constitution and everything said they wanted to take the South by force and bring them into their country. And now they're saying we don't want to. And this alarms the South because they really want reunification as the goal. Mm-hmm. But in my mind, this creates the possibilities for peace, for real peace, because now you can do arms control and deterrence and try to build a system where you have peaceful coexistence, where neither side is threatening the other's existence.
Sure.
But that requires South Korea to say we don't want to take over. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard sell even for the South Korean left. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be the obstacle. Now, I think that Kim and Trump will meet. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump goes to Pyongyang because he likes the pomp, the circumstance, and all the stuff that would go with it. But the number one problem is going to be that in the past, Russia and China both really wanted the US to make peace with North Korea. Now China really wants the US to make peace with North Korea, and Russia really doesn't.
Mm,
Because in any negotiation, they fear the US government is going to push North Korea and Russia to break up, to
right.
divorce, because we don't like that they're working in this axis of authoritarianism that we talk about, which we created with our sanctions policy.
Right.
It's like China really doesn't want to have to be dealing with Russia and North Korea. Not at all. But they're
Mhm.
forced to, right?
Right.
We're pushing them to do this. Iran, none of these countries want to deal with Iran, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's the fundamentalist regime that they have, the religious regime. Do you think North Korea, the secular state, wants to deal with that? Of course not, right? Russia, no, they have their own Islamic insurgencies, right? They don't
Mhm.
want to deal with that. China does as well in Xinjiang. They don't want to deal with that. But we're making them deal with that because
Mhm.
this ridiculous idea that you can somehow tighten this noose around those countries by expanding our alliances, the Japan, Philippines, Taiwan thing is just trying to strangle China. And
Right.
the Arab Gulf states and Saudi Arabia allied against Iran is just it's analogous to, and we say we're not bothering anybody. It's like a guy takes a AK-47 and walks around the sidewalk around your house, pointing it at you, says, "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm not bothering anyone."
Yeah.
I think you're probably going to be bothered.
Right.
I mean,
Eventually,
our
some.
aircraft carriers go to the South China Sea, just outside the international limits, and fly planes and everything. What do you think America would do if China put an aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Mexico and started flying planes just outside our territorial waters? We'd have a hemorrhage. I mean, we almost went to war over that in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Mhm.
Yet we're doing it to them and not wondering at all about why there's an issue, right?
Yeah.
The whole expansion of NATO towards Russia and everything. It's just like it's crazy.
Yeah. Like Jack Kennedy said back in the day, I'll blow up the world if Russia dare puts their missiles in Cuba.
Yeah, it's
It
it's it's
we have that inability for empathy, and I think that's
yeah,
the America's greatest fault is that we never seem to have that empathy. Like, oh, maybe
yeah,
China doesn't like it when we have spy planes right off their coast or sail warships through the Taiwan Strait,
yeah,
which is only 70 miles from China to
yeah,
Taiwan. Or putting troops on the Kinmen Islands, which is near
yeah,
major cities in China. Like, maybe they really don't like that, and maybe Russia doesn't like having all these weapons that are being essentially, operated by America, and the
yeah,
targeting being done through Starlink and, different probably
yeah,
CIA contractors working in Ukraine. I could understand why they don't like that because
yeah,
once again, if they did that in Mexico, Canada, Gulf of Mexico, like you said, we'd have a hemorrhage. We would tell them we'll blow up the entire
yeah,
world before you even think about putting a single hair of one of your troops in one of our territories or one of our neighbors. We would
yeah.
yeah, we'd go to war in a heartbeat.
I mean, and like we promised Russia we wouldn't expand NATO, and then we let Estonia and Latvia and all those countries in. And
Mhm,
I'm like, hello, it's just getting crazy. Now, I have an apartment in Finland. I've been working there for many years because they're also like a weird inbred population of sorts.
mhm.
But it's their economy is destroyed right now
Yeah.
because of the war in Ukraine, because the EU put all these sanctions on Russia that's hurting the EU more than it's hurting Russia. Russia's doing fine.
Mhm,
They're just rebuilding pipelines to India. It's like they've got a market for all of their oil and their natural resources, whereas Europe is screwed. Finland, their economy, they used to have Finnair used to be the closest hub in Europe to Asia, and now they have to fly around Russia.
mhm.
They used to have all the rich Russians in St. Petersburg would send their wives to Finland to go shopping, and they have dachas on the lakes in Finland. The biggest department store in Helsinki used to have as many Russian speakers as Finnish speakers in it. Now there's none. And as a result, like Finland, they recently had to lay off 15% of government
Mhm.
because they just don't have the money. At the same time, they decided to raise taxes. So the VAT went up to like 23% or something, 27%, something ridiculous. And
Right.
you just look at this like, hello. The problem is you got to get out of this idea that sanctioning your neighbor is going to be good for your economy. It's not. It's artificially good for ours now because The other thing I find bizarre in Europe is in Europe, China is considered just as bad as Russia because they're not opposing Russia in the Ukraine. China is trying to be kind of neutral and stay out of it, right? Because they want to do business with everybody. But
Right.
in Finland last year, they canceled their Lunar New Year festival. They canceled all the events. The Finland China Friendship Society basically doesn't really exist much anymore, but they still have a Finland North Korea Friendship Society that's doing fine. I mean, it's like China is they're not buying stuff from China basically as a result. They're not having Chinese students. I mean, it's the first time ever I was in Finland this last month, and everyone I saw who was Asian was speaking Japanese. There was no Chinese hardly at all, and it used to be overwhelmingly the other way around. So what's happening is Europe is buying stuff from America at a higher price rather than buying it from China, which is making our economy not really hurt as bad as it should from what we're doing with the sanctions on Russia. But that's not going to last. You know, so we got to realize there's an artificial element to that. And Europe is really in bad shape.
Yeah.
So I just don't get it. It's like all these sanctions, tightening the noose. It's making those countries work together. It's emboldening the BRICS countries, which is more than half of the world.
Yeah.
You know, what are we thinking? You know, we're thinking that somehow we can get an extra 10 years of hegemony. Yeah, it worries me.
Yeah, I think we're moving towards the multipolar world now, and I think the U.S. is just going to have to accept that we're no longer the top dog. And really, I don't think Russia and China look at what we've done over the last 30 years and think that they would like to do that too. I think they're kind of like, look, our countries are much older, but we finally figured things out. You know, we're finally going to be kind of a serious player next to the Americans. And like, still, I mean, like, we're still head and shoulders above both China and Russia. But I mean, like, if you look at like, you know, GDP per capita in China versus the US, I mean, we blow them out of the water. But that being said, they're still growing. So, you know, I think we're just gonna have to kind of eat our lunch and say, all right, well, they're serious players, we're serious players. We have to figure out how to manage this, you know, this economic competition together. It shouldn't be a power competition about who rules the world, because eventually someone's going to decide they want it more than somebody else, and that's when, you know, the rockets start flying. And as we said throughout the show, you know, you just can't have that. You can't.
I mean, we're the ones that have military bases everywhere. China has one naval base in Djibouti, and they're talking about another maybe in Equatorial Guinea.
And then they have a listening, they have a listening post in Cuba that people freak out about. And they flew a balloon over here 2 years ago, and that caused everybody to lose their fucking minds, which, you know, eventually we found out, oh yeah, we spent like $500,000 to blow it out of the sky, but that was literally just like a misplaced weather balloon.
Meanwhile, we're flying planes right off their shore, and we have satellites that can read their license plates. I mean, it's not like we're not doing the same thing. And China, the other thing is, like, we're making it like China is this huge military threat. They don't want to be a military threat. They want to be able to defend themselves. But what they want is to develop their economy. They want to spend the next 30 years developing their economy, and they find that they have to build up their military this much to keep themselves feeling secure is actually not something they want to do, because it's a liability for them as they're going through this demographic crisis with too many old people and not enough young people working because they had one child families. And they want to really just economically develop. And we're doing everything we can to stop their economic development, when we used to be the ones telling everybody you should become a free market society and develop your economy so that you can have enough money to buy our crap.
Yeah, now it's pretty much the other way around.
Yeah, it's hypocritical. It drives me crazy. The hypocrisy is what drives me crazy. You know, I'm like, yeah, if we're actually wearing white hats and they're actually wearing black hats, fine, we can criticize, but I don't think there's a difference in the shade of gray of our hats.
No, not anymore. Joe, I think this is probably a good place as any to wrap it up. We've been going for almost 2 hours. I've absolutely loved every second of this conversation, so we'll definitely have to do another one. I have so many ideas for shows that we could do together with other guests. So like I said, I'll definitely be reaching out to you in the future, and I'm looking forward to future conversations.
Anytime. It's my pleasure.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right. Well, why don't you tell the good people where they could find you and support you, and hopefully kind of get you up to be the, you know, the envoy, or be a part of this whole envoy again.
Well, as I said, I've never in my life wanted a role in government. I mean, I'm a libertarian, right? We hate them. I don't want to be part of one of the enemy. But I think Trump presents a unique opportunity because he's unorthodox, thinks out of the box, and is willing to do things differently.
Mhm.
And so, to that end, if there's a way I can be of help, I'm more than eager to do so, because I think it's a special place in history, a moment when something good could happen, and it also could backfire because of the people that he's appointed so far, right? So we have to be a
Right.
little wary of it. But I think he needs also someone in his ear telling him how to think like we think, right, as
Right.
libertarians. All I would say is, if you want to know more about our adventures in Korea, there's our movie Big Bang in Pyongyang about our trips with Dennis Rodman. It's hilarious. It even says so right there. It says hilarious on the cover. The other one I would brunch is, I have a brass group, and we have a CD out called Philharmonic Brass
Oh, I
plays
love
John
that.
Williams.
Hold on.
Available on Amazon or anywhere else. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there
That's
you
my
go.
mouse pad.
Except ours is eating a French horn. Yeah, and actually in this group we always as an encore number, I arranged one of the North piece. We only play film music with seven brass. And as an encore, I wrote one of the North Korean film music pieces that we play as an encore. It's pretty fun. It's really kitschy 70s sort of music, the way they do it, but it works in a brass group. So those are the two things I do that I care more about than I care about science and politics.
Nice. Yeah, I know exactly.
Aside from weightlifting and all the other stuff that we share. So, how can I not love this guy? A libertarian who lifts weights and plays music and hates our foreign policy. We got to get together.
No, of course. Yeah, it's funny because I always say, I'm like, man, I should like talk about my band and heavy metal music more, and then I just don't. I see something that like makes me angry. I'm like, all right, I have to throw out an opinion on this, and then like maybe I'll be listening to music at the gym. I'm like, oh yeah, this song's really good. I'm going to share this with Twitter, and like nobody cares about it. But I'm like, you know what? I just want that to be out there. So like, if Pantera or War of Ages or something heavy's playing, I'm like, yeah, this is it. And
do you know the Finnish heavy metal band Lordi?
I know who they are, but I'm not familiar with them.
Yeah, I sang backgrounds on one of their albums.
Oh, no way. Wow. Yeah. Oh, that's so awesome. Yeah. I'm so jealous of Sweden because it seems like they have like genuinely one of the coolest like metal scenes ever. I mean, that's like
Finland too.
In Flames, Soilwork, Vader, like all these huge, just awesome metal bands. It looks like you go over there and everybody has like the corpse paint and is just happy to go sing and like drink a beer and listen to some heavy metal. Like,
I mean, in Finland, they play heavy metal in coffee shops and grocery stores. It's like in the museum there. I took some American friends over. One of them's a real big metalhead, and we went to their national museum. It's just one small building, and they had a whole room devoted to heavy metal because it's such an important part of their culture.
Wow. I had no idea.
And it was funny, as we were flying over, he's looking at the window at all the empty space. He goes, now I get it. That's why they're so good at metal. They could play drums all day and no one will hear and complain. Because he lives in New York City, where they complain if you say anything.
Yeah. Oh my God, that's hilarious. Well, Joe, this was sincerely a pleasure. Like I said, we'll have to do it again.
Yes.
I'm gonna close out the stream here. If you don't got anything else,
I'm good. I'm looking forward to next time.
Absolutely. All right, Joe. Well, thank you so much. Everybody, thank you so much for listening. And until next time, take care.